So what we're going to learn today is an introduction to the Our Water, Our World program, a little bit about integrated pest management, because that's what we're all about here, how climate change and weather affects our landscape. So understanding what's happening when we're getting these periods of heat and wet weather. We're going to understand the concept of biotic versus abiotic factors and how to identify them. We'll talk about growing resilient gardens that will reduce pests, and then how to address pest problems when they do occur. So lots to cover. Let's go for it. What is the Our Water, Our World program? It is a program designed to bring awareness between pesticides and water quality and provide pest problem-solving education. You can find Our Water, Our World materials in well over 200 hardware stores and nurseries across the state of California. We're mostly Greater Bay Area, but we're expanding throughout the state. In most stores, what you'll find is a rack you'll see kind of not on the far right, but the second right is a rack with handouts. That's free information for you in the pesticide aisle to take to learn about how to manage certain pests with less toxic options. And then you might also see a QR code poster in some stores where you can just scan and get those fact sheets on your phone. And then some stores also have these little blue tags right on the shelf underneath the products that are going to highlight the less toxic products on the shelf. So you know when you are reaching for one of those products, as long as you spray according to the label or apply according to the label, you will be causing less of a harm to our waterways, which is very important. And you can learn more about, or you can read all of the fact sheets, and you can learn more about water quality, learn what stores partner with the Our Water, Our World program at the ourwaterourworld.org website. And I'm just going to we're not going to go too much into pest management specifically, but it's all connected. All of what we're going to talk about is related to reducing pests and having healthier gardens. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of what we teach at Our Water, Our World, which is Integrated Pest Management. Not the most sexy name I'll share. I think there's a movement to change it to Sustainable Pest Management, but it's called Integrated Pest Management because we're integrating lots of strategies at once to reduce pests. And we always use science-based strategies when we're doing this. So we're going to go to reputable resources when we're looking up how to manage pests. We're not going to go to social media or a blog. We want to go to, usually university extensions have excellent resources. Integrated pest management looks at the system, either the home or the garden as a whole, really a holistic view. Takes a big step back before, taking any action, kind of understanding the big picture of what's happening. So we ask a lot of questions. What is the problem at hand? And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today, because a lot of times problems, things look like maybe a pest issue, but really it could be something else, watering or weather causing that issue. So can we identify the problem? What is it? And then if it is a pest, we're going to identify the pest. And can we live with it? That's a really good question to ask before, immediately reaching for something. When we understand what's happening and we can learn more about either the pest or the problem, maybe we don't have to take action, or we don't have to take as extreme action, because we understand maybe it's just a nuisance pest, or maybe the pest is going to only last a few weeks and not cause a lot of damage, or maybe it's it will turn into a butterfly, which will be a pollinator. I know there's some caterpillars that are pests, but then they become pollinators. So kind of understanding our thresholds. Maybe we don't have to neutralize the bug. Maybe we can let them do their thing. They're part of the ecosystem. Then on the right, there are the steps of IPM. Identification is first, of course. Is it a pest or is it something else? If it is a pest, what is it? What's its life cycle? What are its natural enemies? Where does it live? What does it eat? Learning about the pest is going to give you a much greater understanding of how to manage it most efficiently and most safely. Then there's prevention, always, first step in pest management. Can we get ahead of problems? Talk to your neighbors, buy pest or disease resistant variety of plants, see what other people are dealing with in the environment, and maybe we can get ahead of them, ahead of those pests with certain barriers and, gardening practices. Then there are action steps. First is cultural controls. It's focusing on the health of the garden. A healthy garden has less stressed out plants and then therefore less pests. Pests really like stressed out plants, which we have a lot of these days because of the weather. So really focusing on the health of the environment. Then there's mechanical controls, traps, barriers, tools, physical things that we can use in the garden or home. Biological controls, which is really understanding the ecosystem of the garden. There's a lot of other things out there that actually can help us manage pests without any pesticides. They're just living organisms that do it for us. And then chemical controls, which are pesticides, always a last resort in IPM, trying all the other steps before we reach for a pesticide. And then when we do, it's going to be the less toxic option, applied very carefully and safely. And we can touch on that at the end. So today, though, we're going to talk mostly about cultural controls because the environment, the health of the plants is really affected by our changing climate. All right. So to garden in California, you kind of have to understand the weird climate we have here. In normal times, we have a weird climate, at least in contrast to the rest of the country. I'm from the New England area, so it was very much of a transition to learn how to garden here, but it's exciting because you can grow so much more throughout the year here. And it's hard to say what is average, climate now these days, or what's the average year look like, because it's been really wild for the last couple of years. But generally, we expect most of our rain to occur between November and March, and then long stretch of dry air time from April to October. And then normally our temperatures stay pretty moderate here in San Mateo, with their peak in September. So this is normal. It's normal to have periods of wet and periods of dry, and our moderate temperatures. But we have noticed, of course, you've all noticed something happening differently here, that we still might kind of get that, but things are getting more extreme. So we still do have, last year, this past winter, we had very wet months, and we might still get some rain actually, even in April and May. Very, very wet, wetter than ever, almost. And then we had a very hot summer as well, with really long stretches of hot weather. So this is, we're still getting kind of our normal pattern, but it's just getting more extreme. So we're going to expect, as the climate changes, this is going to be it's going to be less predictable. We don't know what's going to happen next winter. Are we going to get atmospheric rivers again, or is it going to be back to drought? We don't know. But we can expect the unexpected, I guess. More hotter temperatures for sure, for longer periods of time, longer stretches of dry weather, and then heavier rain, a lot of water in really short periods of time. And a lot of people are probably asking, or you might know already, is the drought over? Technically, yes. But I do want to just share, it's unpredictable. We've had droughts in the past and they've ended and then they've started again. So we never know. At the moment, the answer would be yes. You can see on the map from April 12th, 2022, we were in most of the state was in extreme or severe drought. And now almost the whole state is in no drought or just abnormally dry, which is pretty amazing for a one-year change. And then you can see most reservoirs in the state are at or above their historical average, which is very exciting. And the snowpack levels are at their highest, at like record-breaking highs. So, which is also very exciting. Very important also for San Mateo, because San Mateo gets most of its water from Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, which is out near Yosemite in the Sierras. So lots of water. Hopefully we'll slowly, this is another thing we're worried about. We got so much snow this winter that we need to really hope for a slow warming of the temperatures. If it, in 2 weeks turns hot and summer's here, that's gonna be a lot of water to melt real fast. So we want to hope for a slowly warming temperature that will cause the snowpack to melt slowly, enter the ground, and go into the groundwater. Also recharge, so keep recharging those reservoirs. And actually, one thing, speaking of groundwater, one thing I did want to note, while our reservoirs are looking pretty good right now, our groundwater in the state is actually still quite low. And that's because we relied on groundwater so much during these years of drought. So recharging those groundwater, those wells and the groundwater is going to take a significant time. And hopefully that melting snowpack can help with it. All right, so let's understand what happens to our plants during periods of drought or high heat and less water. When a plant is stressed from lack of moisture, it closes its pores on its leaves. They're called stomata. This is to reduce water loss. They want to hold on to as much water in the plant as possible, so they close their pores. When they do this, they look wilty and sad. This would usually, you'll see it, you'll go, oh, this plant needs water. Usually you're right. But when they close their pores and they keep the water in, that means they're also closing their pores to absorbing carbon dioxide. So actually they're stopping their photosynthesis process. When they take in carbon dioxide and turn it into plant sugars, that's photosynthesis. But when they close those pores, they can't absorb the carbon dioxide. So they're actually kind of pausing their operations there, which means that they are not going to be growing. They're not going to be able to take in nutrients. They're not going to be able to create food for themselves. So it's kind of a stasis period. They're like, I just need to hold on to water. I can't do anything else right now. Of course, if this happens for a long period of time, it will limit the plant's growth, the plant's development, and could potentially cause long-term harm. So we want to make sure that, if we can give our plants water during periods of high heat, we should do that. Even trees, we need to make sure that they're getting deep waterings. Usually trees, established, large, older trees, during periods of drought still need 1 or 2 really deep waterings throughout, just 1 or 2 in the spring or summer. We don't need to do it every day. We're not giving it a lot. We're just giving it 1 really good drench that will hopefully get nice and deep and recharge that soil for long term. And then what I want to share also is that sometimes when plants close their stomata and hold on to the moisture and they look all sad and droopy, it's actually because they're overwatered. So before you water, if you're like, that plant is looking really sad, but I feel like it was just watered, stick your hands in the soil, make sure that it actually is dry before you water it again, because stress can still cause it to look droopy, and stress from overwatering can cause it to look droopy. So just make sure you're not overwatering your plants as well. And we'll talk about watering in a little bit. And also what we're going to talk about a lot today is that water stressed plants can have symptoms that resemble diseases caused by plant pathogens. So it's really important to understand what's happening in the garden. Is it water stress? Is it a disease? And also there's also an unfortunate connection that water stressed plants are going to be more stressed. They're going to be less healthy. They're going to make themselves more vulnerable for pathogens to infect them. So this, of course, it could start with just drought damage, but then it could lead to disease as well. So some things we can expect to see in periods of a lot of sun, a lot of heat, is sunburn, of course, on leaves and on trunks and bark. Leaf problems, leaf drop, tip dieback, so just the tip of the leaves dying. Bark can split in periods of high heat. Wilting, discoloration, just kind of a dull, not super vibrant appearance, and stunted growth. Of course, that stunted growth is going to be caused for a lot of reasons, but one of those is that closing of stomata, slowing down their photosynthesis and growth. So these are just things to look for. I do want to just share that if we have sun damage on our leaves, we don't want to remove them. We want to keep them on the plant because the leaves are still going to, those sunburned leaves are still going to shade the rest of the canopy. If we pull them off because they don't look good, we're actually just exposing the rest of the leaves and the rest of the tree to sun, and we're just going to create more sunburn. So I know it doesn't look great, but if you can leave those leaves, that's going to be helpful for your plant. And sunburn on peeling bark can be, sometimes it's not avoidable if it's just really hot, but we'll talk about later ways to avoid or reduce that sunburn issue. And then, as I've said in this webinar already and in other webinars, stressed out plants attract pests. So water stressed plants will attract pests. Heat stressed plants will attract pests. And then what we're going to see is that there's certain pests that really thrive in drier, hot, dusty conditions. Spider mites and whiteflies, definitely. Powdery mildew is actually a very strange fungus. It actually likes warm, dry conditions as opposed to most others like rust and black spot. So you might see more powdery mildew. Bark beetles can thrive in those conditions as well, and especially when the bark is already damaged, it's a great in for those bark beetles and those tree borers. So we're going to keep an eye out for these, and maybe ways to prevent them would be setting up sticky traps to collect the white flies, look for white flies, gently pruning out. We don't want to over prune during periods of drought, but gently pruning to increase airflow so it's not so dusty and stagnant. And just monitoring. Good monitoring is going to be really your #1 defense against pests. The first sign of any of these pests, we can get ahead of them with certain strategies. All right, so last year I was talking about how to care for your gardens in drought, but I just can't believe how much rain we got. I wasn't really talking about the opposite end where excessive rains. So now we're kind of talking about both. We have periods of very little water and high heat, and now we're having periods of extreme rain, like crazy amounts of rain at a very short period of time. So let's learn about what happens to our gardens when we have a lot of rain. So with those rain and wet, soggy conditions, what we're going to see a lot of course, snails and slugs love cooler, cooler temperatures, wetter, moist environments. Sluggo or iron phosphate baits is a very popular and very safe pesticide to use for snails and slugs, but right now the environment is just so wet and we still might get some more rain that pesticide is just going to wash away or melt real quickly. So actually traps or snail boards are much more effective for those pests. Earwigs, ants, I know everyone has ants. Ants coming in the home, cockroaches entering the home when it's really wet outside or when it's really dry outside, which is, these ants are very sensitive. Ants come in, but earwigs and cockroaches can also come in when it's really wet outside. So to keep them out, the most, it does take a little bit of effort, but the most permanent long-term solution is sealing up the home. We can bait and trap all we want, but if there's a way for them to get in, they're going to come in. So look where those critters are coming in, follow their trail back if possible, add fresh caulk, even a piece of tape temporarily can help. Weather stripping, door sweeps, seal up the home, from preferably like from the inside if you're in if from the inside is the easiest, and then outside you can work on later, and all of those will physically keep those critters out. Weeds, big problem right now. I know weeds, of course, love rain. So we are going to, manage that. We are going to avoid weeding when the soil is very wet. When the soil is wet and we step on it or disrupt it, it can cause compaction. And then when it dries out, it's just going to be a solid brick. So we do want to avoid walking around on wet soil and working with wet soil. But for weeds, there's a lot of things we can do: physical pulling, weed whacking, mowing, once the soil is a little bit more dry. Sheet mulching, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but we are going to see a lot more weeds when it is rainy. And then you might be seeing a lot of mushrooms as well. Mushrooms are not really a problem unless you have kids or pets that might eat them or touch them or play with them, because we never know if they're going to be safe. Well, we don't never know, but you have to really study and really be sure they're going to be safe before you touch them. But what I would recommend is just putting on some gloves, removing them by hand, just the above ground part, and not worrying about it. It just means that there's fungal life in your soil, which is great. That's what you want. But the mushrooms are just the above ground part of that organism. And they can cause, they just don't look good, or they can cause maybe a risk for pets and kids. So just remove them. You can put them in the compost bin. Fungus and disease, of course, also thrives in, very wet conditions. I know peach leaf curl is always a problem here in the Bay Area, but it's really bad this year. So you're just going to kind of pull off those affected leaves, focus on the health of the plant, and we'll talk about those cultural controls later. Just really, if you can have the healthiest plant possible, it can fight off any fungus and diseases. And then mosquitoes thrive in very wet conditions, of course. And mosquitoes are actually becoming almost all year round here. It was pretty cold this winter, so they might not have been out in the depths of the cold, but mosquitoes can breed in a teaspoon of water. So we are going to make sure we are removing any standing water if mosquitoes are an issue in our yard. That could just be leaf litter that collected water during a rainstorm or irrigation. But pots, saucers, tarps, any debris, we're going to make sure we're disrupting it, get the water out of there, and avoid to avoid mosquito breeding. If we do have fixtures like troughs or bird baths should be just changed regularly anyway, but ponds or water troughs for our animals that do require, standing water, we can use, there are certain products called mosquito dunks or mosquito bits that are a bacteria that you put in the water. It only kills mosquito larvae. It will not harm your animals or birds or anything else that drinks from that water. So other things to do in the garden during excessive rains, we're going to note those areas of standing water, like in that picture 2 slides ago where that water was pooled up around the trunk of the tree. That's a recipe for disaster. That means that water was not filtering into the soil quickly. It was pooling around the trunk of the tree. That's just asking for diseases and rot in that tree. So maybe we notice it in the spring. Maybe we'll clear the grass away from around that tree, maybe work in compost into that soil, add some mulch, just make that soil more able to accept water so that when rain does come, it can move into the soil quickly. So again, we're going to note the areas of standing water and see what we can do to correct it once it's dry out. We're not going to fertilize during times of rain. It will just wash away. We're not going to apply pesticides with rain in the forecast. Even eco-friendlies, it's either going to wash away or it's going to wash away into our waterways and cause harm there. We are going to avoid compacting the soil. So no walking on it. Try to work it as much as possible. And then we're going to avoid pruning during wet conditions. unless absolutely necessary. And the necessary times would be if you have a branch that was maybe damaged in a windstorm and it's kind of hanging on by a thread, you might want to prune that out. Or if you see a branch that could damage a tree or a home or some sort of structure, we want to prune that out. But we do want to avoid having open wounds on our plants during periods of wet. And then we're going to make sure our potted plants have good drainage. They have a hole in the bottom of their, actually not just having the hole in the bottom of the pot is sometimes not good enough if it's really like sitting on a flat surface and not draining out. So make sure those pots really do drain out and they're not sitting in a saucer full of water. All right, so I mentioned biotic versus abiotic. This is, I mentioned earlier, identifying is the problem that you're seeing caused from a pest, or is it something environmental? And that's this issue right here. Biotic means that it is caused, some issue or disorder caused by a living organism, like insects, mammals, disease, bacteria, something like that. Abiotic plant disorders are generally caused by environmental conditions, not organisms. So they're sometimes called non-infectious diseases. And so they can be caused by sun, too much sun, too little sun, temperature, too cold, too hot, too much rain, too little irrigation, nutrient deficiency, pH imbalance, lots of reasons why our plants could fail because their needs are not getting met, and it has nothing to do with pests. So really important to understand the difference. And I just want to share one example is, yellowing leaves on our plants very often can be thought of as a disease issue, but most often it's a symptom of improper watering or lack of nutrients. And sometimes it is very challenging to identify between biotic and abiotic factors or disorders, but there are some clues that we can look for. So for biotic, which would be those organisms, the living organisms that could cause it, we're going to look for evidence of the pest, fungal growth or mites or insects. Bacterial ooze and nematode cysts can be a sign of a disease or nematodes. And then, so we're going to look for like physical evidence of the organism or things that it causes, like that bacterial ooze. We're also going to look disease problems are very usually limited to a certain species of plant. So is it only affecting one plant or maybe a neighboring plant that's the same species, or is it throughout the garden on many different kinds of plants? So if it's across the garden, there's a whole section in the corner that's all suffering from this very similar symptom, then it's probably abiotic because it's lots of different kinds of plants getting the same kind of damage. And as I mentioned, causes of biotic diseases or biotic disorders are fungal spores, bacteria, insects, and mammals, vertebrate damage. And then again, abiotic disorders will apply. These are the environmental issues will occur on many plant species and will not spread from plant to plant over time. It's kind of a one and done thing. Again, too much or not enough water, compacted soil, pH issues, soil salinity, herbicide, overspray, air pollution, frost and hail damage, sunburn, fire damage, all things that can cause abiotic disorders. Because it's so hard to identify, I'm just going to go over that a few more times. We're going to identify, if we're kind of struggling, we're going to identify the host plant, including the cultivar. We're going to learn about that plant. What is its lifespan? Maybe it's at the end of its lifespan, or what are its needs, and am I getting those needs met? We're going to examine the environmental conditions, what's happening in the environment, what just happened. Was it really cold the other day and then it was really hot, or, was the sun, really strong that day? Are other nearby plants affected, and what are the symptoms over time? Did this just happen, or has it been kind of slowly growing? And this picture shows sunburn on a tree here, because it's all one side of that tree has the same damage, and it's exposed to the sun, so that it was really hot that day, or that, maybe a week of real high heat, so that's sunburn. And then Paige is going to share the link to an article that talks more about these abiotic versus biotic disorders, but I really find this chart very helpful, and that what she's going to send out will have this chart in it. But again, ways we can think about or look at our environment. What are the plants affected? Are they unrelated, or are they the similar or closely related type? That will clue us in whether it's an abiotic or a disease. Plant age, plants of all ages being affected, or only, similar age plants. The pattern of the symptoms, is it regular or uniform? That would be an abiotic disorder. Kind of random or irregular would be a pest or a disease. The rate of development, sudden, did it just come on all of a sudden, or was it slowly developing over time? This is a really good reason that we need to be out in our gardens regularly, checking on our plants, because if we, don't go out there for 2 weeks and then we suddenly see this issue, it might not have been, we don't know if it was slowly over time or a sudden onset, because we don't know. We weren't out there. So that's one more plug to get out in your gardens regularly. Just do a walk, see what's happening out there. Is it spreading, or does it not spread? It was just, damage on leaves. Then it was probably abiotic from a one, event. Or if it is spreading, that could be a disease. And then, of course, look for evidence of a pest or a pathogen. So we know kind of what happens to our plants now during these times of high heat. So now we're going to talk about a little bit how to prevent those issues from happening, but we can do in our gardens to prevent it. So we want to reduce our damage and stress from hot sun and heat waves. We're going to protect our plants. So a few ways we can do this. We can use shade cloth, which will protect the more vulnerable plants like seedlings, annuals, food crops. You can use it to protect really anything. It's important to tent the shade cloth. We're, creating a hoop. We're not laying it right on top of the plants. That's not going to be effective that way. It comes in a lot of different thicknesses. You can buy by percentage shade cloth, so how much of the sun it is blocking out. 30 to 50% is ideal for food crops. 40 to 60% is going to be best for pretty much most plants. So if you go in that 50% range, it will cover both. 75% or more will be beneficial for shade-loving plants. This is going to give them that extra shade during these periods of heat and high sun. And then, of course, don't forget yourself. 80 to 90% shade is great for people. And then another thing we can do in our garden to help our trees is use a tree paint, or you don't have to use just specifically tree paint. This Ivy Organic brand is very popular. I've seen it around. It can help with pest and rodent damage as well. But you can also just use a 50-50 mix of latex-based paint and water, as long as it's any light color. We're going to use either white, light green, light yellow, whatever it is. As long as it's very light colored, you can use it. And it's going to be a 50-50 mixture, latex and water, latex paint and water. And you can just use it on the trunk, up from the crown of the trunk all the way up to where the first split, the first crotch of the branches. The rest of the tree should be protected by the leaves. So the canopy of the leaves will protect the rest of it. So you just need to focus on the trunk, keep that trunk protected. It'll keep it cooler, protected from, and won't get as much sunburn or bark peel. Some other tools that we can use in the garden are anti-transpirants. These products. There's some popular brands, Wilt Stop or Cloud Cover. They're basically sprayed on the leaves of the plants and they coat, it's a clear coat of kind of a waxy material that goes on the leaf. And what it does is it seals in the water, and it prevents water evaporation, so that it kind of prevents that process where those stomata close and to keep the water evaporation in. It's doing it for the plant so that the stomata doesn't close and the plant can continue to photosynthesize. So you're kind of helping it. You're like, you don't have to worry about evaporation. This product will do it for you. You can continue growing and photosynthesizing. That's you talking to the plant. I hope you all talk to your plants. And it's very helpful on young plants and new plantings as well, when they're just kind of getting started in the ground. And then some other tools are these hydrogels, which are water absorbing polymers. They're these little beads that you can work into the soil around the root zone, and it can actually reduce our watering by 50%. The polymers themselves can actually hold 200 times their weight in water. So anytime you're watering, they're just going to expand and hold it and provide the root system water for longer periods of time. Great for hanging baskets, window box containers, plantings that dry out much quicker will reduce your needs for watering. There's usually two options that I've seen on the market. There's Soil Moist is not the only brand out there, but kind of the most common brand. There's the Soil Moist, kind of like the regular ones. Those are made from a kind of a plastic. So I don't recommend putting those in the ground, but you could use them for like hanging baskets and containers. And then there's naturals, the Soil Moist naturals, which are made out of a biodegradable, either corn, wheat, or like yam product. So they will break down. They last about a year. And they can provide the same benefits. And so those are going to be better if you do want to put them in the soil, but I would, focus on your hanging baskets, your containers first, and make sure you read the directions. You don't want to just dump them in. I've heard some things can go awry if you put too many in. So just definitely make sure you're reading the label on those. All right, we're going to pause here for some questions and a poll.
Thanks, Charlotte. Yeah, we have a poll right there. We'd love to hear your thoughts on, did you know that changing weather conditions impact the presence of pests in your garden? We have a wonderfully engaged audience here, so thank you for answering this poll. We'll just wait 30 more seconds. I think 30 seconds was too long. I think folks put in their responses. So we had 71% of y'all that said yes, and then 29% of y'all that said no. So maybe there's some good learnings here. Thank you, Charlotte. And we're going to move into checking what our Q&A questions have developed. And Charlotte, we have our first question as, when you say 1 to 2 deep watering for the tree, is that 1 or 2 per week or per month?
Thank you for that question. I actually sorry, I wasn't clear. It's actually 1 to 2 a season. Really, like, this is just kind of, we're not going to forget our trees during periods of drought, even the really, older established trees. Especially years and years of drought, they can suffer, their roots can suffer. And then of course, storms can come, like what just happened. And then they, they're not as strong. So branches break or they just get uprooted. So even during periods of drought, we're going to focus on our established trees and give them 1 to 2 really deep soakings per season. So really just like early spring, if we didn't get a lot of rain, 1 really deep watering. And then maybe later in the summer when it's super, super hot still, another really, really deep watering. That alone, that is going to, keep our trees healthier and stronger.
Thank you, Charlotte. We got another question that just came in, so thank you all for putting those questions in. It was asked, I recently transplanted a mature orange tree. Do you have any suggestions besides deep watering to help it?
Well, deep watering is definitely number one. Even if it's an established tree, you just, replanted it. So it's kind of reforming its root zone in that area. So you're going to want to make sure you're going to water. We'll talk about watering in a little bit, but you're going to water out at the drip line, the outer edge of the branches, and very deep. There are certain fertilizers that have more phosphorus in them, which help with root growth. So to help your plant get more established and get those roots back deep in the soil, you could consider a fertilizer with a good amount of phosphorus. Let me think here. I think that's it. Focusing on soil health, preparing the soil. Well, it sounds like it was already planted, but using the compost in the soil, organic fertilizers, and mulch to keep that soil nice and moist and an even temperature over time, which we're going to talk about in the next section. And actually, I just wanted to go back, sorry, to that first question, which was a really good one. When I was, I'm saying 1 to 2 a season, those are for our established trees. Of course, our smaller like fruit trees, even though they might be established because they're of a certain age, smaller trees might need more watering than twice a season. They still might need, our established lemon trees still might need 1 to 2 waterings a month. So you kind of have to understand the age of the tree, the size of the tree, and then kind of go from there.
Thank you, Charlotte. And yeah, as I said, Charlotte's really great at answering questions on the fly, so thank you. We don't have any more questions that have come in right now, so we'll continue the presentation, but folks in attendance, please continue to send those questions to the Q&A feature, and at the end, we'll have a longer portion for questions.
All right. Thank you. Now we'll dive back into just how we can bolster the health of the garden so we can create resilient gardens that can withstand both periods of drought and periods of rain and stormy weather. We're going to focus on building healthy soil, my favorite topic, using mulch, choosing the right plants, watering deeply, which we already touched on a little bit, and our healthy garden maintenance. So if you've been to a Flows Bay webinar before, you've probably heard me talk about building soil and using compost, my favorite topic. So feel free to ask me questions about either of those. We are going to add compost to build our healthy soil because compost is organic matter that has been broken down by bacteria, fungus, microbes, worms, and other decomposers. It's the final product. It's not our food scraps that we're putting into a bin or into a pile. It's the final product that comes out. It's nice and moist and brown, and there's no chunks of anything that we recognize. Super chock full of nutrients. And it has so many benefits to our soil, and it makes our soil so resilient in all conditions. So compost turns our soil into a sponge, which is going to be great both in periods of rain because it will absorb that water so that water doesn't flood or wash off your property into the street. We want to absorb as much of that as possible quickly, of course, also to avoid flooding. And then it helps in periods of dryness because it holds like a sponge. It holds that water for a really long time and can feed that water to your plants, your plant roots over several months of dry. So adding compost to our soil, it's going to improve our soil structure as well, whether we have sandy or clay soil. When we add organic material like compost to our soil, it's going to make that soil, the structure better. So it's going to basically, when you have sand, it's going to glue those big particles together so that water doesn't just rush through and the particles aren't all like, falling apart. It's going to glue them together, hold them together so that water and nutrients can kind of be held available for your plant roots. And then if you have clay, you can add organic material to the clay soil and it will break up the particles and allow for, roots, water, air, shovels to infiltrate a lot easier. I know clay can be very challenging. As I mentioned, it increases our water retention in the soil. It adds microbiology to the soil, which is necessary for plant growth. Plants need life in the soil, just like we need life in our gut to process our food. Plants need microbiology in the soil to process their food. Compost can balance pH levels, can recycle nutrients. It reduces the need for chemical fertilizers and pesticides because we're growing healthy plants that don't have as many pests. And it actually can fight pathogens and bad bacteria in the soil as well. I will just share a few ways to add compost to your garden. If you're having a new planting, you can add maybe an inch or two, really just probably an inch of compost to the top of your soil and then gently mix it in before you plant. And then if you have existing trees or shrubs, perennials that you're not going to be digging up the soil, you can add compost to the top of the soil, top dressing around the outer edge of the plants, the drip line, and then you can water it in, maybe cover it with mulch. It will be absorbed into the soil. You can also really gently mix it into the top like inch or so of the soil. You just don't want to disrupt the soil too much. You can also make a compost tea, which is I would look it up on YouTube. Actually, compost tea is like it's what it sounds like. It's making a tea out of your compost material. So but there's really cool ways to do it. And then we're going to use organic fertilizers. We're going to nurture our soil and plants with organic fertilizers. Organic fertilizers are they're plant food made from organic material like mushrooms, manure, bone and blood meal, kelp. They're not derived from fossil fuels. When you're looking at the front or side of the fertilizer box or bag, they always have 3 numbers on them. They're always NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. They have different purposes. Nitrogen helps green growth grow up, phosphorus helps root growth grow down, and potassium helps kind of overall health. So you'll see the numbers are a little different on different formulations, but usually the numbers will be less than 10 on a organic fertilizer container. That does not mean there's going to be less nutrients. It's just going to be more sustainably released to your plants over time. They also organic fertilizers contain micronutrients because they're coming from organic materials that already are made out of lots of different nutrients. And it is a slow release fertilizer, which is what we want. I know it sounds less exciting to slowly feed our plants, but it's going to create healthier, hardier growth over time. Just a little bit more about the difference between organic versus synthetic fertilizers. Organic fertilizer feeds soil microbiology. It increases the soil health. It does not run off into local waterways. You cannot burn your plant with organic fertilizer because you're feeding the soil. The soil organisms are feeding the plant. It is actually more economical. While maybe the packages organic might be a little bit more expensive, over time, you don't have to add it as frequently as synthetic fertilizers. And they're usually made from renewable or byproducts of other processes. For synthetic fertilizers, they're feeding the plant directly. It's kind of like steroids for your plant, really fast growth all at once, which plants don't really like. It's very stressful to plants and to get a lot of energy really fast, and then it could cause a crash, just like when you drink an energy drink. So we want, that's something we want to avoid, because stressing out the plant and causing a lot of new growth all at once can invite pests. Synthetic fertilizers also high in salt. So over time, we're adding salt content to our soil, which is going to inhibit the soil's ability to take up water. And then synthetic fertilizer can contaminate waterways when it is run off into the waterways storm drain. Another great tool in protecting our soil and helping our plants is mulch. When I say mulch, mulch is just a protective layer on the soil. It can be made out of gravel, oyster shells, rubber, but I do recommend an organic mulch, which would be wood chips, bark, straw, even like newspaper or cardboard, compost, leaves, lawn clippings can be used as mulch as well. So we want to, it will help in, well, it covers the soil, it protects the soil. So especially in, periods of hot sun, soil can create, when it's really dry, it can get a crust on top, which then can turn it to be hydrophobic. So say you have a crust and you go to water your plant, you'll see the water beating and just kind of moving away. The soil is repelling the water. That means it's hydrophobic. So to protect the soil from getting that crust, we're going to add mulch on top, and that mulch is going to kind of hold the water there, let the water sink into the soil slowly and infiltrate slowly. So also helps in periods of heavy rain, helps that water get into the soil as much as possible, which is what we want. It reduces evaporation by covering that soil. It keeps the soil cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter, which is really great for your plant roots because those plants do not like big temperature swings on their root systems. And then it holds the soil in place to reduce compaction and erosion. So the soil doesn't blow off, in high winds or anything like that. Or heavy rain. Rain, causes a lot of erosion and runoff. So we want to hold that soil in place. Some other benefits: it prevents weed germination, it feeds the soil, and it provides habitat for beneficial insects. Cover crops are another great way to just build healthy soil and keep our soil covered. So cover crops are kind of like, they're annual crops that don't really produce food, although you can eat fava beans, and some of them you can eat if you want, but they're very affordable seeds. Because they're really just used for soil building and protecting our soil when we're not, planting in a certain area. Great for veggie beds that are not actively growing. They can add nutrients to the soil while they're growing, especially those legumes add nitrogen, replenish the nitrogen in the soil. They're constantly feeding the soil microbes through that process of photosynthesis. And we're protecting the soil from damage and erosion by having those roots growing in the soil, holding the soil in place, protecting the leaves above the ground will protect the soil from any intense rain hitting it. So really wonderful for erosion control and building soil over, periods where we're not really actively growing. And other great benefits is that it can attract beneficials to the garden. Beneficial insects, need food all year round. So if we can have cover crops growing, providing food for them in the winter. And fava beans are so easy. They're really cheap to buy, really easy to grow. And they're actually really, you can kind of use the little fava tips, either in salad or saute them. And then when they grow, if you grow some of them to get beans, you can either save the beans or the seeds for next year's cover crops, or you can eat them. All right, so more about cultural controls, how we can have resilient gardens. We're going to choose plants that are going to be appropriate for our climate. And that doesn't mean only California natives. Well, California natives will be more adapted to our climate, though our climate is changing, so they need to adapt as well. But they are going to be more suited to our mild winters and our long, dry summers. But Mediterranean plants from South Africa or from Chile, South America, are going to be more adapted to our climate. They all kind of have the same climate in those regions. So those are going to be, they're going to do the best in our environment. They're going to be okay with less water, with hot sun in the summer. They're going to be less effort because they're going to just thrive where you put them. And they're going to use less water, of course. So, and you can also choose pest and disease resistant varieties as well, if possible. Some more tips for choosing the right plants for your garden. We always say right plant, right place. The right plant in the right spot in the garden will thrive and make your life a lot easier. We'll need less effort, less maintenance, less water. And that doesn't mean just, so we have our unique climate in the Bay Area. We have microclimates within different, cities and neighborhoods, and even your garden has its own microclimates. So really understand where you're planting certain plants and make sure the needs of that plant will be met where you put it. So really understand, what is the sun needs, how many hours of sun, what are the water, what are the space needs, what kind of soil does it like, will that work for this spot in the garden? Yes, then go for it. And if not, it's a risk. It might be fine, but it might not. It might be more of a hassle. So really match those plants to the conditions of the garden. And understand your mature plant size. Is it going to grow? It might only be a 4-inch pot right now, but it could be, 4 feet wide and 4 feet tall at the, when it becomes full grown. And that might be too big for the space you're putting it in. If you have to constantly prune it back and keep it, prune back, that's actually going to weaken the plant, stress the plant out. So try to give it as much space as possible to really thrive. And don't overcrowd your garden. And then make sure you can group your plants, by the needs, match the needs to each other. Low water use plants here, the higher water use plants over here. When they're grouped together, they're going to all have their needs met. And then if you're growing food, some more resilient options for food would be grow with heirloom varieties. So there's a lot of different kinds of, most grocery stores only show us so many, veggies, but if we go to some cool garden centers, they're going to have different varieties of veggies and fruits that might do better in our environment, grow a lot easier. And the heirlooms tend to be those, specifically, native or not native, but grown to suit our climate. So look for those. The heirloom varieties are going to be more drought tolerant and just more suited to our climate. Also more fun. You get more variety of plants to eat. And then when you're planting and you're maintaining your garden, really just consider plants that support the whole food web that's around us, the soil, the birds, the good bugs in the garden. There's, plants really provide so much for these critters, and these critters actually provide so much for us. They eat our pest insects, they pollinate our plants. So really just keep them in mind when you're growing. Variety of plants is better. Tall, low ground covers, flowering at different times of the year, keep our, food throughout the year. Maybe there'll be a host plant for this monarch, or not monarch, but this caterpillar, this butterfly, maybe the birds will nest in it. Just really think of the ways that we can provide food, habitat, and build our ecosystem in our garden. And then specifically in that ecosystem, we really want to invite in our natural enemies. So those good bugs in the garden, the predators or the parasites in the garden that can do a lot of pest management for us. We have, ladybugs, green lacewings, syrphid flies, parasitic wasps. All of those can do a lot of pest management for us, and they're super cool to watch in action in our gardens. So to attract them, we are going to plant for them. You know, the best way to attract those beneficials is to bring in lots of different kinds of food. So they, and I also, you know, they eat our pests. So we're not going to get rid of every single pest. We're going to, you know, maybe monitor, have some tolerance levels, know that if we leave a couple of aphids on our rows, some green lacewings or ladybugs are going to come and eat them. If we have no pests, we won't have any good bugs. But to keep those good bugs around, we do want to provide nectar and pollen for them as well. And, you know, habitat. So we're going to look for flowers that look like daisies or sunflowers with that button in the middle and the ray of petals around. Cosmos, asters, coreopsis, echinacea, always all great options. And then flowers that grow in clusters of tiny flowers. Yarrow, sweet alyssum, ceanothus, which is my favorite. Some herbs like oregano, parsley, mint have beautiful little flowers on them that these beneficials really love. So plant for them, and they'll come, they'll stick around, they'll eat your pest insects. You're feeding the ecosystem. And we touched on watering earlier, but I really want to just, you know, focus on this, because when we have plants with wide, deep root systems, it just creates a much more resilient garden, resilient plants to withstand lots of different kinds of weather. So when we are watering our plants, we're going to keep in mind new plants, even if they're drought tolerant or require less water, we still need to water them more frequently when they're first in the ground, because we're helping them. Their root system might only be this big and there's no water, like, you know, there's not enough water there for them to just be plopped in and ignored. We need to encourage their root zones to grow out and down. And that will make them drought tolerant in the long run. So we're always going to water out at the outer edge of the plant, the drip line of the plant. That's where, you know, the roots are going to go out, and they're going to water deeply. So, you know, so that the roots go nice and deep as well. I had this question earlier this week. I can't tell you what deep is for your garden or for your plant. I know that there are some sample like irrigation timer guides on the internet for, you know, check this area, San Mateo or San Francisco. I know Urban Farmer Store in San Francisco has kind of a guide on how long to turn an irrigation drip system on for certain kinds of plants. Use those as a guide, and then feel the water between waterings. Feel the dirt between waterings. To know and like dig down or use a moisture meter to make sure that you are really getting that water nice and deep. What I've learned is most people don't leave their irrigation on long enough. So probably longer or more, either more hand watering or longer irrigation is going to be better. And then stretch the time out between waterings to make sure that the top layer of the soil gets dried between waterings. And then here's, yes, just we're going to focus the water at the drip line, because that's where the roots that absorb water are. They're more out. You know, we're not watering right at the crown, the base of the trunk, because those roots, those thick roots don't absorb water. Those are just for structure. And you're actually just inviting pest issues if you're watering right at the base of a plant. If you've had irrigation installed or you've done it yourself, keep that in mind that as your plant grows, you're going to move the irrigation out as well. So, you know, irrigation is a great way to water your plants deeply and efficiently, but make sure, you know, you're keeping an eye, and we're never putting the irrigation right up to the crown of the trunk, like in this picture. Clearly someone installed it right next to the trunk and actually buried the trunk as well. Not good, but so as your plants grow, we're going to move the irrigation out as well. And irrigation systems are fantastic. They can be really simple. They can be really complex. They can be, you know, on your smartphone, or just a really simple, you know, hose bib attachment, but really helpful for deep, efficient watering. You can set it to go off at 4 a.m., which is a great time to water really early in the morning when the soil and the air are still cool, and then it allows the plants to dry throughout the day. And then just remember that they're not set it and forget it. Of course, as I mentioned, we're going to move the irrigation as needed. We're going to check for leaks. Sometimes in the late summer, rats and other rodents will start chewing irrigation lines looking for water. So check for leaks. Make sure the plants that you want to get irrigation are actually getting it, and it's enough, and it's not too much. So really, make sure you're paying attention. And check to see before you install any of these irrigation tools that there are not, there might be some rebates in your area. Check with Bosco's conservation program, which this website will be probably put in the chat and offered to you later as well. Check to see what rebates you can get. There's a lot of controller rebates, irrigation rebates that you could get. All right, and then last part of the, keeping our gardens healthy throughout, and keeping them resilient and looking for pest problems is healthy garden maintenance. Just getting out in your garden, taking care of your garden, removing the food crops that are, once they're done, removing them, pick up fallen fruit and nuts that can attract pests and critters, removing fungal diseased leaves and branches, pruning them out lightly, getting them off site. And just like cleaning the garden will help us monitor for problems, both abiotic and biotic disorders. So again, you'll be caught off guard once, if you miss something and the problem gets really bad, that's going to just be harder to deal with it later. But if you catch it early, you're going to be able to manage it much easier with less toxic options. And leave the leaves if you can. In certain areas of the garden, leave those leaves, let them decompose into the ground. They're great mulch. They're habitat for beneficial insects. And actually, one thing I didn't mention, I know I talked about covering the soil, using mulch, leaving the leaves. We do want to make sure that we are leaving a small area of the garden bare, because that actually, and like uncultivated, just a small area, it doesn't need to be, it could be in the back corner, because that actually can be habitat for native bees, which are ground dwelling bees. So while covering the soil is beneficial, we do want to make sure we leave a little bit uncovered for those bees. And then we're going to keep our weeds in check. This will be weeds can suck water up from our soil. So if we want all of our water to go to our plants, we're going to remove the weeds. We're going to pull them when the soil is dry. Earlier the better. They're easier to pull. They're going to be more easily damaged that way. We can mow them or trim them if they're tall. Just don't do that if they've gone to seed, because you'll just be spreading seed all around. And then encouraging sheet mulching. Sheet mulching is just layers of cardboard with mulch like wood chips or bark on top, smothers weeds, or it's sometimes used for lawn removal, smothers lawn, and it breaks down slowly into the soil, creates healthy soil, and will reduce weeds in the future. Not forever, to be honest, I've done it in my yard, but I definitely will reduce it for several seasons, and then it'll be a lot easier to deal with deal with weeding later. From firsthand experience, I can tell you that. And then a few more things to have resilient gardens is we want to keep our rainwater on site. We're going to, as I previously mentioned, we're going to keep it in our soil as much as possible by using that compost and mulch to turn our soil into a sponge. Sorry, I'm going to get to that rest later, but keeping our rainwater on site, we'll have healthier gardens. We'll be able to replenish the soil. It reduces the needs on our municipal water, and it will actually prevent flooding and pollution. When we have places for that water to go, it will pool less, it will cause less runoff, it will go less into the storm drains. So one great option is to capture that rainwater. 1 inch of rain over 1,000 square foot surface, like a roof, can collect over 600 gallons of water. Your rainwater catchment systems can be quite large, like some of these in these pictures, if you have that space, but they do create them in ways that can be nice and like narrow up against the walls, against the home. But then they can also be small, like that picture in the bottom left is just, you know, small like 55-gallon barrels daisy chained together. It's a great way to start small and see how much water you can collect and how much you use, and then add more as you go. So that's a really great way to kind of see how it works. And there is a rain barrel program in San Mateo County. There's a rebate for up to $200 to get these rain barrels. So I don't think it's going on right now, but definitely check back. I think in closer to the fall, they'll be having that information. So you can sign up for the Flows to Bay newsletter to get updated on that. And then rain gardens are a beautiful way to really collect rain, slow water down, help it sink into the soil, but also have really beautiful ecosystem for plants and birds and, you know, our beneficial insects. So rain gardens are mostly just kind of like depressed areas of our lawn that kind of collect the water either from a downspout or from, you know, maybe a driveway. It's directed towards this depressed area. There's rocks, there's like kind of a creek bed, and then there's like plants in it that can withstand both heavy rain and dryness. And it's just kind of a way to slow sink, spread the water down so it doesn't necessarily run off into the street or into a waterway, and it can stay in our soil. There are rebates related to lawn conversion and installing rain gardens at flowstobay.org. And there's also a future webinar about rain gardens specifically on May 6th. So if you're interested, I would attend that webinar as well. And then we're going to increase our permeable surfaces in any way we can. We have hardscaping, maybe break up the concrete, add DG, which is decomposed granite, or pavers, any kind of pea gravel, anything that will still absorb water, and so that the water can still go down into the soil, feed our plant roots, and not rush off into the street. And then before we use pesticides, we always want to address the cause of the pest problem. Pesticides do not solve the pest problem. They will kill the pest. They're very good at that, but they could potentially cause kill beneficial insects as well. And, you know, if your plant is stressed out, those pests are going to come back and you're just going to keep spraying. So we really want to address the cause. Why is that plant stressed? And what can we do to make it healthier and happier and less attractive to pests? And proper identification, I've already covered on why it's so important, but really before we reach for a pesticide, identification is important. We want to know, is it a good bug? Is it a bad bug? What is it we're dealing with? Also, the labels on the pesticides will list what pests it's effective with. So if you know what your pest is, it's not on that label, that pesticide is not appropriate for you. I just want to share, you know, how easy it is to think of or see critters and just think that they're pests because they're in our garden. But on the right is the monarch butterfly larva, and on the left is I want to call it a sphinx moth. I forgot what it is. I had the note the other day. I'm sorry. Hold on, I have it right here. It's the larva of a hummingbird moth. Sorry about that. Which, when it is a moth, is a really wonderful pollinator, but the larva, the caterpillar, does eat a lot of plants. So that's another great way to think about your thresholds. You know, yes, it's eating my plant, but I have other plants and it's not eating the whole thing. So it's gonna turn into a moth that pollinates my plants later. So maybe have a little bit of a tolerance with those caterpillars. And then this one's really important. We're going to understand some pests are seasonal and expected. So again, it might not be your plant stressed, but it could just be the time of the year that this pest comes. So we're going to hopefully expect it. We're going to be prepared. We're going to understand maybe it's going to go away in a few weeks. It's not going to cause that much damage. We can just keep populations low. And pests are food for beneficials. So if we don't have any pests in our garden, we will not be creating a healthy environment for beneficials as well. So think about your tolerance levels that way as well. Something I like to share with everyone now that I've been like clued into it the other day. Plants also have much higher thresholds, tolerance levels for pests than we do. Very often we go for, getting rid of a pest because it's damaging the leaves and the leaves look bad. But the plant doesn't care. The plant has other leaves. It's still photosynthesizing. It's still growing. So just have that tolerance, as long as my plant is doing healthy, I'm just going to do whatever I can to keep it healthy, and maybe just squish or, remove those damaged leaves when possible. And understand that if there's a bad infestation, it's probably a clue that something is not working with that plant and that plant is stressed out. So you have to address that issue. And some more resources that will be provided to you later in a PDF or later in an email. The Our Water World website, more information about our program and common pest issues. The University of California IPM program has both information about pests, but also plant care and beneficial insects as well. So not just a pest issue. Great information there. Bugguide.net can identify bugs for you, and you can learn more about the insects before we, help us understand how to deal with them or just not to deal with them. And the National Pesticide Information Center is a great resource for very understandable explanations of how pesticides work and what their harms could be.